Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you this afternoon. And so, as you can see, we will be talking about cultural competence and specifically about how we might think about cultural competence in regards to reframing our practice. And by practice, I mean our pedagogy, what we do in our classrooms with our students. So I am the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at the School of Information Science. And so what we do lots of things in the School of Information Science. And a lot of what we do is train future librarians and information professionals. And so if I slip up and say library, please know that this is applicable to any of your students or any of you who are teachers or instructors. A lot of our information professionals do teach in their jobs. So why are we here today? So again, we're going to talk about cultural competence, and I want to present this cultural competence as a way for you to reflect and engage in critical self-reflection. And so when we are teaching our students, we have lots of diversity in our classrooms, even if we can't see that diversity. Certainly there's a lot of diversity that we can see, but probably just as much that we can't see. And we need to be thinking about this diversity because we don't teach in a vacuum, right? And so I'll get to lots of examples later on, but you know, we're in a time of COVID and quarantining and isolation and things of that nature. We are also in a period of racial unrest. We are in a time of economic depression, right? So there's lots happening. So in addition to thinking about the differences of our students and, how we might interact with them and use all of these differences to bring richness and robustness to our teaching in the table, if you will, we need to be thinking about our students as whole individuals, as whole people, if you will, right? So it can be very easy to just think we have to do this content, we have to cover certain things, and that's all very true and all very important. But we do need to be thinking about our students as people and what they're going through when we are in our classroom sessions. And so with that said, with this idea of critical self-reflection, I would also encourage you to be comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable, right? There might be some concepts and some discussions that are new or perhaps, just uncomfortable for whatever reason. I would encourage you to lean into that. And also, in general, when you're thinking about cultural competence, be afraid, I should say, excuse me, don't be afraid to take risks, right? And really just ask the questions that need to be asked and, just engage as fully as possible, because that's how we're going to really get the most that we can out of cultural competence. So I'm just going to start with some very basic definitions. I'm sure none of this is unique or brand new to you, but just so we all are on the same page for our discussion today. So we have diversity, right? And if you look in the dictionary or think about textbook definitions of diversity, it really is just the state or fact of being diverse. Right, so that could mean so many different things, right? And again, I mentioned these could be visible differences, they could be invisible, right? So religion, race and ethnicity, gender or sexual orientation, all of the different things that make us who we are. And so continuing on with that definition, variety, right? Just simply put, a point of difference, right? And just to point out with this part, that difference does not mean negative, right? I think sometimes that becomes the automatic, oh, well, if something is different, then that's bad. That is not the case. Okay, so diversity also talks about the inclusion of individuals representing more than one national origin, color, religion, socioeconomic stratum, sexual orientation, ability level, etc., etc. That is not a comprehensive list. And I just want to take a moment before we continue with our definitions and concepts that language is important when we're doing this work and we're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, language is important. And so I have an article here that's on the screen, but it's also on the handout that you received, and talking about the definition of diversity. So now this was published in 1999, but it is still as applicable now as it was when it was published. And it's talking about how words become watered down. And they become watered down and they prevent us from having the meaningful, change-filled discussions that we really want to have. So if you think back, it used to be that multiculturalism was the thing to aspire to and the thing that we wanted to embrace in our teaching and in our classrooms. Now, multiculturalism is great, but it became an umbrella word, if you will. And it became this kind of catch-all phrase that, could mean a whole lot of different things. And what wound up happening is that multiculturalism became very palatable and it became non-threatening. And so I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but what I am saying is that if we need to have conversations about racism and oppression and anti-racism and privilege and all of the things that we need to have these hard conversations about, if you couch these harder concepts in buzzwords or watered down words, it prevents us from having conversations that we need to, right? So if you want to have a conversation about racism, that's the word that you need to use, right? We shouldn't be saying that I want to have a conversation about multiculturalism, right? Because it's allowing us to check boxes without getting to the heart of the matter. And so in some ways, the word diversity, equity is kind of sliding into that realm. Social justice, right? There are ways of kind of saying, I'm having this conversation that I think I should be having, but if we don't use specific language, the conversations are perhaps not as useful and beneficial as they could be. So thank you for indulging my little PSA on language. All right, continuing on with a couple more definitions. Culture, right? So culture is very much associated with diversity. And so culture gives us more context, right? So diversity is saying that we're different, and culture is giving us context about the different things, habits, rituals, food, dress, etc., that are the things that actually make us different, right? And a lot of cultural competence is about celebrating these different customs, traditions, and values that are associated with different societies and communities. All right, so when we're talking about diverse or underserved populations, just think, about the variety of diverse students that we may have in our classrooms. All right, and so we often think about people of color or people who are experiencing homelessness or members of the LGBTQIA plus community, etc. Right, but as we explore, and we're in a global society now, we also have folks who are refugees. We have lots of religious diversity, we have linguistic diversity, and things of that nature. So again, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but just to give us a sense of really just how diverse our classrooms are. And particularly now that a lot of us are doing online or distance education, this diversity just increases more so than even in our face-to-face classrooms. All right, so I'm giving you one of my favorite definitions of social justice. And the reason that I like this definition in particular, there are so many definitions of social justice, is that it makes reference to standards, right? And by standards, these are the norms of our society, right? So we value whiteness, we value affluence, we value Christianity, we value heterosexuality, right? We value very certain characteristics. And when people or groups deviate, if you will, from these characteristics, it's easy for these folks to be considered quote unquote others, right? And it's these standards that often create systemic racism and systemic barriers in our society. So this definition is saying that we need to look beyond these standards, and we need to look at these standards, for what they are, and think about what's missing and who is missing, right? And that will allow us to think about, talk about, and hopefully change some of these systemic inequities. And the last part of the definition that I think is really important, and this is also something that is very true for cultural competence, is that social justice is always a process and can never be fully achieved. All right, so we'll talk about that in terms of cultural competence in just a moment. But social justice, equity, diversity, inclusion are things that we will continually be striving to achieve. All right, and just to kind of further flesh out the definitions, diversity, just like when we talk about cultural competence, these are things that we aspire to. It's part of the critical self-reflection that we need to do to increase our own awareness and understanding. And then when you have this new knowledge and you've done the reflection, then you have to decide what you're going to do with that information. And it's the doing and it's the action that brings us to social justice. So while all of these terms and concepts are obviously very much related and complementary, they do different things, right, if you will. And so we need to be aware of people and groups that are diverse and different, and we need to actually do something to achieve and work towards social justice. All right, so apologies if this is a little bit small. This is a meme that's been going around, and it's actually based on an article from Inside Higher Ed, the online publication, and it was written by Dr. Daphna Lazarus Stewart. And Dr. Stewart was talking about, again, this idea of language and how these terms are very complementary, but they don't quite mean the same thing. And so Dr. Stewart says, for example, diversity asks, how many more of this particular group do we have this year than last year? So, for example, how many more African American students might we have this year than we did last year, right? So that can be a very, how do I say, it can be a very transactional type of question, right? Because we're just looking at numbers and statistics. And if we have more students of color this year than last year, then we are technically achieving diversity, okay? But then Dr. Stewart goes on to say that if you're thinking through an equity lens, right, and moving past diversity, equity is then going to say, well, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Okay, so if we're thinking about equity, why is it that we can only maintain, I'm just making numbers up, 10% of the student body are students of color? What are the underlying factors? What is the greater context that makes this so, right? So that's equity. Inclusion then might say, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong, right? And I'll give you other examples of that later, right? So inclusion wants to know if everyone is welcome, because if people don't feel welcome, or if they feel unsafe, or that they are being othered, they don't need to stay, right? And that creates retention issues and perpetuates stereotypes, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, Dr. Stewart says that we need to be thinking about justice as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And justice, also known as social justice, says whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views. All right, so again, why is it that some people feel unsafe? What is the context and behind that? And what is the additional context that allows those who feel perfectly safe to think this is not a problem? And, why aren't they doing something to make sure that everyone feels safe? All right, so just, finishing up with the definitions and concepts, this idea that diversity makes us better, right? Again, when we're talking about Western norms and things that are valued, we're not talking about devaluing or saying that we don't value certain things anymore. We really want to get to the point where we can say that we are valuing more. We are valuing additional groups and additional perspectives in everything that they bring to the conversation. So when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, social justice, and the critical self-reflection work and the personal work, that we need to be doing, this can happen on multiple levels, right? And so this work can happen on the micro, meso, and macro levels. And this is kind of fluid, right? Don't necessarily think of these categories as hard and fast, and one doesn't kind of bleed into the other, right? We can be doing micro work right now in this session, and maybe later you're going to go be a poll worker, right? That's could be a combination of meso and macro work, right? Tomorrow you could be doing something else, and you could be doing micro and macro work, right? So just think of it as being very fluid. And so micro work, again, is that very internal work that you're doing, trying to increase your own knowledge and understanding. Meso work is work that we do in our workplaces and in our organizations. This could also be the work that you do in your classrooms and in your departments. And macro work is larger work that we do in our society, in our world, whether it's on a national level, global level, local city level, etc. But the goal here is that you are working to benefit the larger society. And ideally, we are working to eliminate marginalization and subjugation of those whose voices aren't heard or aren't welcome. So with that said, let's take a moment to talk about intersectionality. I'm sure you've heard the word intersectionality. It was originally coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a legal scholar. And Dr. Crenshaw was talking about interlocking oppressions. And so what that comes down to is that we are all very complex individuals. We are complex human beings. We have so many different things that make us who we are. And it doesn't, there's no formula for this, right? But what Dr. Crenshaw was getting at is that all of these different identities provide us with advantages and disadvantages. And sometimes my advantages might be different than your disadvantages. Sometimes my advantages, we could also call that privilege, are different than your advantages, right? And sometimes, they overlap and they interlock. So, for example, the case that Dr. Crenshaw was working on was an African-American woman who was suing an automobile manufacturer who was her employer. She was a factory plant worker, and she was suing for discrimination. And so what came out in that case is that she was experiencing particular discrimination because she was a woman, and also because she was African American, right? So her gender and her race and ethnicity were the interlocking oppressions in this particular case, right? So this is not to say that women, non-African American women, did not face discrimination. This is not to say that African American men did not face discrimination. But the woman that featured in this case had a very particular circumstance of being both a woman and also African American. All right, so with all of that said, we all have various dimensions of socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, education, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not to say that these are comprehensive lists. We all have lots of different identities, right? So the point here is really to make note of what makes us who we are, and then also think about what makes our students who they are, right? So just because you see an Asian American woman in your classroom, there's so much more to that Asian American woman. And how are we interacting with this young woman in terms of working with her as a whole human being, a very complex human being? All right, so if I had a half day with you, if we were, doing an intensive workshop, I would probably break you into groups and give you this activity. But for the sake of time, and the link is on the bottom of the slide, it's also on your handout. This exercise is called the Circles of My Multicultural Self. And what I would encourage you to do is to take a look at this exercise and think about you as a person and think about all of the different identities that you have. And I also encourage you to dig deep, right? So I want you to go beyond, I'm a sister, or I'm a mom, or I'm a professor, right? These are all important identities. But I also want you to go deeper in terms of, what is your religion? What is your sexual orientation? What is your socioeconomic status? I also would encourage you to think about how have these things changed over time, right? If you were to do this exercise today and then do it a year from now, there might be some changes. Also, when you look at this website for the complete instructions, you'll see that it's also encouraging you to think about how these different identities are perceived by others. All right, so for example, if you are part of the Muslim faith and you cover your head, what perception do others have of you? And how does that enable your privilege, or how does that facilitate a disadvantage? All right, so think about what this really looks like. So just to kind of continue this example, and by no means is this a comprehensive list. I'm just using some very common examples. So if I center myself in this particular example and say that I'm heterosexual, middle class, female, Christian, African American, and have a PhD, right? Certainly there are more characteristics that I don't have on the screen here. So my PhD, my education level, affords me a great amount of privilege on the University of South Carolina campus. I just came out of another session for one of my disciplinary conferences. My PhD affords me privilege in that setting. However, when I leave campus or I leave my home and I'm driving in my car, it is my identity as an African American woman that is always first and foremost in my mind, right? And while, 99.9% of the time that identity affords me privilege, it can be a disadvantage, right? Because I can frequently be judged by my skin color. I could be afraid of being pulled over by police, right? Just, based on experience of others, things that we've seen on television, right? So if I were to be pulled over at a traffic stop, the first question is not going to be, are you Dr. Cook? Do you have a PhD? Do you work at the University of South Carolina? Right? So this is an example of where two of my identities may not be in conflict with one another, but they don't necessarily complement each other either. Right? So just to give you an example of, again, this is very fluid and we can move in and out of our different identities and how we think about them and how they may privilege or advantage us in any given situation. So I end this section with a quote by Audre Lorde. "It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences." Now, just before I move off this quote, I have had pushback on this quote, and I've had people say to me, "I will not celebrate those differences because I don't approve of those lifestyles. I don't approve of those practices," or whatever they decide that they think that they don't approve of. And so my response to that is, you don't have to celebrate it, but you do have to respect it. Right, and Brittany writes right on, right? It's about respect. You need to respect others just as you would want them to respect you. Okay, we could certainly have other conversations about, why people say they don't approve, and the moral judgments that come with certain kinds of discrimination. But that is for another talk. Okay. All right. So what happens when we don't celebrate others? All right. So these are just some examples. These are the two African American men that were arrested in the Starbucks in Philadelphia a couple of years ago. And they were waiting for a meeting to begin. And someone who worked at Starbucks called police because she felt threatened. And according to accounts, I believe these gentlemen had not been in a Starbucks more than 30 seconds. Like, I don't even think it was a minute before the police were called. Right? And it was assumed that they were a threat. It was assumed that they were loitering or, what have you, because they didn't immediately proceed to the counter to make a purchase. And so, very long story short, Starbucks enacted all of this training. But, I would wager to say that they probably still have more work to do, okay? Because these types of things happen all the time. Their police are called because folks are barbecuing in the park, or because a little kid is selling water, quote unquote, without a permit, right? And so I want to say it's California, and I'm sorry I didn't look this up. They just passed the Karen Act, and it's Caren, and it's to facilitate this idea that there's going to be some accountability if you call the police on a person of color and make a false report, right? Because it's become so rampant in our society. All right. Other things that happen when we don't celebrate differences are microaggressions, right? And again, we can do a whole session on microaggressions. And these are small indignities that happen to people who are othered or perceived as different. And so, a lot of this is about verbal comments, but they add up over time. Okay, so these microaggressions rely heavily on stereotypes and false information. So that is one of the reasons that cultural competence is so important, so we can fight back against stereotypes and treatments such as what you have on the screen here. Now, some of these quotes, these are coming from my discipline, library and information science, but I can guarantee you that these microaggressions happen all over, all of the time. It does not matter what discipline or necessarily even what setting that you're in. So, for example, you're Chinese, you should know how to use chopsticks. All right, that's a microaggression because that's based on a stereotype of what Chinese and Chinese American people do, eat, etc. Another comment here says, I've been called ethnic or exotic or festive by my coworkers. I've also been asked if I'm something, meaning something other than race, than the white race. Okay, so microaggressions, micro insults, micro invalidations. Again, this is a spectrum of the types of verbal offenses. Alan, that's a good one, right? Yeah, yeah. And these can be, the microaggressions can be subtle, and other times, you might even call them macro aggressions because they're just egregious and obvious, right? And microaggressions can be levied certainly against individuals, but can certainly be used as generalizations to kind of stereotype whole groups or, whole societies or demographics. All right, last example. These are really just pictures. Halloween is coming up. And despite COVID, there will be people who dress up in racist costumes, right? So, we've got the young woman dressed as a mariachi singer. There's inevitably going to be someone in blackface or someone that is wearing a feather headdress. And these are stereotypical costumes that really do cause offense to these Native groups, okay? There's lots of campaigns. It started at Harvard with hashtag I2M and the students are holding up signs with some of the comments, some of the microaggressions that have been levied against them. And then finally at the bottom here, we have a picture of Michael Brown, who was killed in police custody in Ferguson, Missouri in 2015. And one of the things that we see a lot of, and we see it consistently, is how minority groups, people of color, folks from other marginalized populations are portrayed in the media. Okay, so when Michael Brown died, they posted lots of pictures of him with the goal of making him look menacing or, like he was dangerous, instead of posting the picture of his high school graduation. Right? He had just graduated very shortly before he was killed. All right, so moving on from that, we also have to be careful of this maintaining the status quo while appearing progressive. Okay, so with that in mind, I would very, very highly recommend the book On Being Included, Racism and Diversity in Institutional Life by Dr. Sarah Ahmed. Really great book. And Dr. Ahmed talks about diversity as happy talk, right? This is just talk that we have to make us look we are quote unquote woke or with it, or, that we're talking about current topics. But if it's happy talk and we're not actually doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's just all empty words. Diversity as commodification, right? Can I get money to do a training on diversity? Right? I may not even believe in diversity, but that's the hot thing. That's the trend now. And maybe I can get a conference session, or maybe I can get a grant out of it. Right? That's what we want to avoid. We want this to be real work and not work that is exploited. Diversity as image management. I'm going to hire a person of color to work on my team, not necessarily because I think they bring anything to the table, because it looks good, right? And so I've met my quota, if you will. All right, and that's very similar to paper diversity. Our mission statement, our vision statement. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion in all the right places on paper, right? But do these diverse terms and concepts and goals actually reflect our daily practice or operation? And institutional passing. An institution has all of the right words, has all of the right policies related to DEI, and nothing trickles down, right? The employees, the staff, whomever, don't feel like they're working in a diverse organization. Right? So the institution is passing, but it certainly is not succeeding. All right, so let's get into cultural competence. So there are a couple of precursors. These are, things that we, or the work that we have to do before we even get cultural competence. And the two links for these videos are also on your handout. One is Empathy versus Sympathy by Dr. Brene Brown. You may have read her work or seen some of her videos. And she talks about, we can have sympathy for a person, but that's different than having empathy for a person. All right, so if, say someone that I'll just even give you a personal example. I found out yesterday that a very close friend of mine has stage 3 lymphoma. Now I could have sympathy for her and say, I'm sorry to hear that. All right, and that might be the end of it. But empathy was me being on the phone with her for 2 hours, crying and asking what I can do for her and trying to make arrangements during COVID to go see her. Right? So it gives you an example of the levels. Right? Can I actually try and experience? Obviously, I can't experience what she's going through. I can sit there and I can listen to her, and I can listen to her talk about how afraid she is and how afraid she is for her daughter while she's ill, right? So how do we go from sympathy to empathy when we're dealing with folks who are different and who have different experiences than us? So empathy, just to finish this up, is often inconvenient. It is often uncomfortable. It could actually be painful, whereas sympathy is just kind of a passing, oh, you have my condolences. Empathy is actually trying to, get into those feelings. All right, the other video is called What is Privilege, also on the handout. And the video is a visual demonstration of an exercise that was put forth by Dr. Peggy McIntosh. And the link to the article is also in the handout as well. And so Dr. McIntosh gave a list of different things, and it's a checklist of sorts. And it has turned into a physical exercise. So if I had you all in a room, I would say, if you can walk down the street holding the hand of the person that you love and not fear for your safety, take one step forward. If you can drive in your car and not be afraid of being pulled over by law enforcement, take one step forward. Okay, so when you go through these different things on the list, when at the conclusion, some people could be at the very front of the room, there could be a lot of people in the middle of the room, and there could be people in the back of the room, right? And so again, this visual demonstration of privilege and disadvantage, right? Privilege kind of moves you forward. The disadvantages could move you backwards or you in place, right? And that's, thinking about how different groups perhaps can't make progress or are continuously depressed and stifled in some way. So when we're actually moving into cultural competence, so cultural competence came out of applied health sciences decades ago, right? So this is folks who are working with public and are oftentimes working with people who are different from them. So these are your nurses and your doctors and your counselors and your social workers, right? And so they've been talking about this for a long time, and really talking about how you celebrate these differences so you can effectively and compassionately work with those who are different from you. So there are several models. The one that I prefer is what I have on the screen here. And cultural competence is often put out in the literature as a linear process. And this idea that you move from cultural destructiveness and you move across the spectrum to cultural proficiency. Now, before I explain some of the different categories, I do want to say that I prefer to think of cultural competence as a cycle because, again, like social justice, the definition we saw earlier, this is a constant process, right? So we can move back and forth along this circle, right? You don't get to check a box at the end and say I'm culturally proficient and then never ever have to do any further work, right? That's not how this works. So if we talk about cultural destructiveness, this is what we're unfortunately seeing with some of the hate groups, right? These are groups that don't like groups or communities that are different from them, and they are actively trying to harm or destroy. All right. When I first started doing this work, it was a little bit more difficult to find an example of cultural destructiveness. So unfortunately, that is no longer the case. If we move to cultural incapacity, I still don't like you, but I'm not actively trying to harm or destroy you. All right. So still not a good place to be at all. But it doesn't often does not involve the violence that cultural destructiveness employs. Then we have cultural blindness. This is the equivalent of I don't see color. If you hear people say that, the phrase I don't see color, I think it was meant to be beneficial and it perhaps even looks good on paper. But what happens when you say I don't see color is that you are purposely saying that you are ignoring the characteristics that make people who they are, right? So if you say I don't see color, then essentially you're trying to say that you don't see me as an African American woman, and that's a very important part of my identity. So the cultural blindness / I don't see color, again, is often used as a cop-out to not have these harder conversations. And it really is an avoidance technique as opposed to leaning into, again, the discomfort and taking the risk to do this internal work. We have cultural pre-competence. All right, so now you're kind of crossing the divide, if you will. And pre-competence, is I am becoming more and more aware of people that are different, groups that are different, but I don't actually know what to do with it, or I don't know how to affect change with this information. Right, so it's, you're almost there, right? You know that difference is important and you want to celebrate it, you just don't know how. So when we get to competence, that is when you actually figure out how to celebrate those differences, right? According to that Audre Lorde quote that we read, right? So you're doing well. You know the groups that are in your classrooms. When I talk to my students, I say, you know who's in the communities that you're serving in your libraries, and you're celebrating them. You're including them in your collections and your services and in your staff, right? And then proficiency is just meant to say you're doing all these things and you're doing them well. But as I mentioned, proficiency is not clearance for us to say, I'm culturally competent and I don't have to do anything else. All right, so you may be proficient, but you have to consistently work to maintain that proficiency. There is no end game, or there's no finish line when you're talking about cultural competence. And just before I leave this, I want to mention that I've written a whole book on cultural competence, and our university library does have several e-copies of the book, and it's chapter 2 of Information Services to Diverse Populations that I talk about this more in depth. And then finally, you'll see that cultural pre-competence, competence, and proficiency are kind of ensconced in a box, right? And at the bottom it says cultural humility. And cultural humility, not very different from intellectual humility. And it really is this idea that you acknowledge that you have room to grow and change and expand, and that you are willing to learn and do that work, right? So cultural humility is hopefully an ethos that we all have about wanting to do better and wanting to affect change. All right, just very briefly, this is also on the handout, the dangers of I don't see color, and they're labeling it as a mentality, right? And so if you say that I don't see color, you can't fix something that you can't see, right? So you are purposely kind of ignoring, the differences because they might make you uncomfortable. Or you don't want to take that risk. You don't want to really be empathetic, right? So it gives you kind of that verbal and also like that mental cop out that I just don't have to deal with it. All right. So, but if we don't see color, we're not dealing with our own prejudices. We all have them, and if we don't see them, if we ignore them, then we can't address them. And this stance does tend to minimize those who are othered or marginalized. All right, so this reference is also on the handout. It just goes a little deeper into what cultural humility is. Cultural humility also comes out of the applied health sciences. And again, it addresses this lifelong commitment to the critical self-reflection in the work that we need to do as instructors, as educators, and really just as people, right, who want to address others as humanely as possible. So a culturally competent educator will value diversity, also equity and inclusion and social justice. Will have mechanisms in place to assess their level of cultural competence. All right, so whether it's professional development, or whether it's through additional reading or conversations, trying out different things in your classroom. CTE has sessions on decolonizing your syllabus, racial literacy, queer pedagogy in the classroom, right? These are all ways to work on your level of cultural competence and maintain your level of cultural competence. Culturally competent educators will hopefully be led by leaders who are also culturally competent. That is not always the case, and so that can be a difficult situation to be in, but certainly it does happen, right? And so then we have to see if we can lead from where we are, and certainly try to find other like-minded people so we don't have to do EDI and social justice work in isolation. All right, last two, culturally competent educators will be committed to the continuous acquisition of cultural knowledge. All right, again, that's cultural humility, and will find and develop ways to adapt to and embrace diversity. So finally, just a graphic here to talk about equality versus equity, and that's important for cultural competence and EDI and social justice. This is just meant to display the idea that people are inherently different, right? And so cultural competence asks that we celebrate those differences, but this graphic is trying to emphasize the point that there is no one right way, right? So if I'm working with graduate students in the School of Information Science, that's a very different group than undergraduates in biological sciences, right? So we can have lots of different tips and strategies, but none of this work is prescriptive, right? Because this work depends on us knowing our communities, our populations, and then customizing the work to the audience, right? If we don't have a little customization, it may not work, right? Because again, one size does not fit all. All right, so leaving you with some reflection questions as we begin to wrap up. Where are you on the cultural competence continuum? Is that where you want to be? Where do you think most people fall on the continuum? And what can you as an instructor do to promote cultural competence? And by promotion, this could be, in your family, in your house of worship, in your local community. It could be in your classroom. It could be in many different places, right? Again, there is no one right way. So we're going to finish up by talking about transforming our practice. Is your organization ready for real talk? And again, organization could be your department, your classroom. It could be, us on the University of South Carolina campuses. It could be in a variety of different places, right? So are you ready to talk about race and other hard topics explicitly? Right, and so then this is also the part of the language discussion that we had a little earlier. Are you ready to use the words that you need to use to have the conversations that you need to have? Okay, so if we're talking about diversity, or I should say, if we're talking about racial incidents on campus, right, the conversation not to have is one about general diversity. Right? We don't want to talk about how do we increase diversity on campus when what you really mean to say is how do we eliminate racist acts in our community, right? Different conversations. So with that said, are you ready to be uncomfortable, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice work, they are not always comfortable or convenient. Are you willing to defer your comfort, privilege, and or advantage so those from marginal groups can participate or feel comfortable? And finally, are you ready to slow down, change course, and try something new? Okay. So those are more questions to ask yourself and those around you. So this is again from Dr. Sarah Ahmed, and she also says that we need to know our organization. Right, we need to know what we're dealing with so we are able to affect some type of change. She references diversity as a policy mechanism to accommodate conflicting heterogeneity. All right, so again, that's really that paper diversity, right? We're going to put the right words in place so we don't have to have a larger conversation about equity or justice. And again, mentions of happy talk and excellence as a device, right? So this is kind of the idea that you're going to check different boxes and you're going to go to different webinars and you're going to read different articles. We've seen that a lot this spring and this summer, now that a lot of people are talking about anti-racism. And people are reading, the book by Dr. Ibram Kendi. They're reading things by Robin DiAngelo, and these books and these primers, if you will, about being anti-racist. And so that's excellence as a device. But are you taking it further? Are you actually implementing what you're absorbing? Right? And that's the same thing with cultural competence. We want to move this awareness and this new kind of enlightenment, if you will, into actual action. All right, so one last thing from Dr. Ahmed. She says, to be welcomed is to be positioned as the one who is not at home. Conditional hospitality is when you are welcomed on the condition that you give something back in return. People of color, and also I would say folks from other marginalized groups in white organizations or majority organizations, are treated as guests, temporary residents in someone else's home. All right, so that speaks to whether or not our organizations are inclusive or equitable or culturally competent. All right, I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to point out a classroom example where I had students talk about cultural competence and equity and inclusion and all of the things that we are talking about today. And when students were presented with an opportunity to enact these concepts in their jobs, their immediate reaction was, that's not professional, right? Because they were so caught up in these norms of what is valued. Anything different than that, they were unwilling to try because they thought they would be perceived as unprofessional, right? So how do we talk about cultural competence, equity, diversity, inclusion, and all of these great things, and how do we move them into action? It's not always an easy transition to go from theory to practice when we want to employ these concepts in our work. And as an example, I've been teaching at the graduate level for about 10 years at this point. And then I was teaching in a library previous to that. And the conversations that I have to have with students have changed, right? So if you remember in the beginning of the session, I was talking about our students as whole people, right? Who come to class upset or come to class with so much on their mind and they're having problems and things of that nature. And so this is not to say that, we're having therapy sessions in class, but sometimes, particularly when, the shootings or the uprising in Charlottesville happened, or in Baltimore, et cetera, and people are affected by what's happening in the world. Sometimes, I find that I have to stop in the classroom and actually just check in with people. How's everybody doing? What's on your mind, right? And then after we acknowledge that moment of hardship or perhaps pain, then we see if we can move on to our content, right? And so that would be an example of empathy, right? Having these hard conversations, acknowledging our students as whole people, and letting them know that you're with them, right? Even if it's just mentally, and see if we can foster a culturally competent classroom and environment. All right, so I would encourage you to think in a general sense, another reflection point. Are you helping or are you hurting? All right, so that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but are you culturally competent? Are you willing to take those risks and have empathy in the classroom? Right? Are you using these things to make a difference, or are you um, trying to engage in these concepts in order to check a box or prove a point? Okay, so broader questions that hopefully can lead to some reflection. All right, so finally, revisiting that list that I showed you a couple slides back, and then I'm challenging you as individuals. Are you ready for action? Right, and so this could be social justice, this could be, are you ready to fully engage and become and maintain your cultural competence? Are you ready to hopefully impact others in your department or in your classroom and help them become culturally competent or become more inclusive, or start looking at your course content through an equity lens? Okay, so different ways, right? Again, there is no one right way to do these things. You do need to find the way that works for you, because it becomes, something that is just so difficult and foreign to you, and your nature and your style. Let's think about it in the classroom perspective. If it's too hard, you might not do it, right? So are there ways that you can incorporate these concepts into your classroom or into your larger environment that make a difference, but also are true to you, right? So again, what might work for me in Davis College might not work for you in your department, but there are certainly tips and strategies and techniques that will work beautifully for you in your setting.